Okay, thank you everyone. I know it is a makeup section, and thank you everyone joining this section so that I can actually talk to some people instead of talking to the screen, talking to the camera. And I know some students might not be able to come, and that's the reason you are seeing me here through the video. But that's fine. I know this week is a very chaotic week, so that I arrange this kind of makeup. I take the video and put it online. And you don't need to come to school to watch this, but you have to finish the video before next week, because this week we are going to talk about a key term which is called authenticity. And we will talk a little bit about some basic skills and principles for doing cultural heritage conservation. And this part is quite critical because it is basically the foundation for us to understand how cultural heritage could be used or could be maintained, and that kind of issue we will talk about in next week. Before that, I want to also make a quick announcement for the tutorial arrangement. I will repeat that again next week because next Tuesday is actually a public holiday, and I guess you guys are too maybe working too hard. No one pick up this issue. So for the MA class, it is fine because we are going to do the tutorial anyway right after this lecture on Monday. But for undergraduate students, either you are taking ANTH 2760 or UGE 82330, next Tuesday, by no ways we can have tutorials unless you can ask our TA Yu Shuang to come to school during the public holiday, during the Mid-Autumn the festival. But it is quite unlikely, I can tell. So we will combine the tutorial for this week and the tutorial for next week together on October 2nd. And I already wrote this in email, just in case someone haven't read it. So the tutorial will be the week after next week, actually. And remember, October 2nd is not a public holiday, even though I know some students are going to do some traveling on October 1st, but October 2nd is not a public holiday, so you have to be aware. Before we get started, I want to just refresh your memory about what we actually talked about last week related to the basic definition and classification of cultural heritage. So remember, when we talk about cultural heritage, we have to understand all these kind of sites and practice and tradition within certain types of frameworks or classification system. And remember, for the later part of this lecture, we will talk about different types of issues associated with this kind of classification system. And remember, even though this classification system was invented, was created by an institute like UNESCO, you thought it is top, it is a very high-rank authority, but we already understand and we already noticed that there are a lot of issues inherited within the classification system. So we already talked about it is not a perfect system, and a lot of ideas and concepts actually are self-contradictory to each other. And this system includes lots of Eurocentric biases. And remember, cultural heritage is not just about tourism. In a lot of scenarios, it is also related to politics, related to a very critical issue, how state or certain authority to impose or to increase the sovereignty or its impacts through the implementation of the classification system. And last week we also talked about different types of cultural heritage. In general, we will have like several different types, and we can like just separate them into three major groups. First, we will have very tangible cultural heritage, just like archaeological sites, just like the big monuments or village houses. And we have intangible cultural heritage, which is new and which you will not be able to identify, will not find in the 1976 documents. And then we will have another new item, which is called cultural landscape. And we will talk about like intangible cultural heritage and cultural landscape later on. For this week, we will focus on one single issue: conservation. And we will talk about some basic idea, some basic principles. But before I go into the detail, I want to clarify one critical issue, or one basic take-home point that you definitely need to know. I know there are lots of concepts and a lot of details in this PowerPoint, and I will try to explain them in a very simple way, but there is a very critical and very important take-home message for everyone here, including those not here, which is when we talk about cultural heritage conservation, its principle, its purpose is quite different from our general common understanding that making a building look good or look new. Because in general public, when we talk about conservation, we are trying to use an analogy. For instance, I will first start a very extreme case, and I know there are only maybe 5 female students here, and originally, if there are maybe 20 female students, that will be more interesting, but obviously it's not interesting enough here. So, is there any female student have done any plastic surgery before? 整容? No? Okay, I know this not because we only have 4 samples here. In our conversation or in our general understanding, we always think about conservation. When we look at an old building or an old village, and we say, yes, we should do something. We should do the conservation. We should save the building. We will always put the analogy here. We think maybe doing the conservation just like doing a plastic surgery for these houses. We have to make them look good. We have to make them look pretty. Of course, we have to make them look new, just like our female students, right? You have makeup, you have plastic surgery in order to help you look good, right? But in general, cultural heritage, when we talk about conservation in cultural heritage, we are talking about quite different things, and I will go to the detail. Especially, we'll go to the general principles for cultural heritage conservation. And then for this lecture, I will talk about 2 specific cases at the end. One in mainland China, in Guangdong. The other one is not in mainland China, but in South Korea. I know this class is for Chinese cultural heritage, and putting a case from South Korea might not be that politically correct, but when we look at the details, when we look at the types of cultural heritage, Chinese cultural heritage and South Koreans cultural heritage actually share a lot of similarities. And that case from South Korea actually is a very good example for us to really explain, understand what is conservation in general. So I will put this example and put them together to compare and contrast with another example from Guangdong in order to help everyone understand what is conservation. So you saw this diagram before last week. We already talked about the basic concept of culture. And now we will move to this circle to talk about what is cultural wildlife conservation and some basic principles. And things you need to understand in the beginning is for cultural heritage, in general, they are very fragile. They are facing different types of issues. For instance, economic development. And did you see all these holes here? All these holes represent tomb pigs. And this is a big cemetery in Sichuan. And this cemetery dating back to 2,000 years ago. And this cemetery was discovered because of the digging, the bulldozer digging, the modern development. So we have a lot of modern development in mainland China, particularly recently. So a lot of heritage sites have been damaged, have been destroyed by modern construction. And remember, in China, a lot of cultural heritage sites, they were built by, or they were made of soil. Or for instance, this is a garrison site in Jian, in northwestern China, and we will have a wall, the Great Walls, dating back to the Han Dynasty, about like almost 2,000 or 2,800 years ago, and everything is made of soil. So when we have weathering and corrosion, cultural heritage sites will just disappear naturally. And then we have earthquake in China almost every year, and houses, especially wood houses, will just collapse when we have a huge earthquake. And also we have warfare in different periods. For instance, the Summer Palace in Beijing was basically destroyed completely during a warfare. And we have other examples showing the destruction of very beautiful palaces or gardens due to warfare. So cultural heritage is very fragile, and they have a lot of issues during the history, during the social during their social life. So how we can do, what we should do in order to preserve this building or the houses, if we think they are valuable, if we think they are good enough for us to invest the money. For cultural heritage conservation, I have to say it is a very specialized area or discipline. You need to learn chemistry and at least some chemistry and physics. And also you need to learn how to use some equipment, just like X-ray equipment, in order to understand, for instance, the mineral for the pigments or the materials for buildings, in order to do the conservation. And it is very specific and technical. And I'm not going to talk about these aspects here. If you really interested in this area, I would recommend you to take another class, Preserving Cultural Heritage, offered by Professor Sharon Wong, also from our department. She will talk a lot about very specific and technical skills that have been employed in cultural heritage conservation. And then we need to understand the legal system here in China. And I know this might not be like that relevant, but you have to understand that in mainland China, the system is that all the cultural heritage, once they are proclaimed as cultural heritage, to a certain extent, they should be protected by the state, and they should be belong to the state. So I want to highlight this because a lot of issues related to village houses or historical houses actually are related to this legal system. And I will explain this issue later during the week when we talk about village. But remember, the legal system in mainland China is quite different from some other places. For instance, in the US, on a private land, the so-called heritage sites or historical buildings basically belong to private. So the conservation issue or the protection issue is completely depending on private. If the owner could like to just take apart the whole building or to rebuild the whole building, basically the private owner can take the initiative to decide how to preserve a cultural heritage site. Sorry. But in mainland China, no. Once a site or a building was declared as cultural heritage, then the legal system from the state will join into the whole stakeholder parties. For a lot of archaeological sites, when you visit them, you will see this sign. This is in Chinese, but when I translate this, it's saying that the name of the site such and such, and it is an important cultural relics protection unit, and this site was established, was built by PRC, of course, and we have the date here mentioning when the site was built there. If a site has been recognized or a site has been registered in the system, then we will see this kind of label to indicate the name of the site, the area of the site, or when the site was registered. And in 2005, in mainland China, there was another big legal framework trying to strengthen the protection for different types of cultural heritage. And remember, this legal system was there in 2005. At that time, people already have the concept of intangible cultural heritage. So in mainland China, the state legal system already tried to integrate tangible and some movable cultural heritage, like intangible cultural heritage, historical areas together to strengthen the protection. Okay, now we have a legal perspective. We have some technical method or technical skills, but how we can protect cultural heritage and what we should do in reality. So I will start from the basic, from the beginning. So when we talk about conservation, in general, in principle, it is a time reversing process. All the cultural heritage, just like our life, is going through its life. And for instance, the deterioration or the disappearing of color or falling apart of different components were actually a natural part of this time process. For cultural heritage conservation, what we need to do actually is trying to reverse this time process in order to save or in order to maintain the status of cultural heritage and trying to bring it back to a certain time spot so that we can extend its life a bit longer. So I want to use one more example to illustrate this idea. So just like our face, right? We're getting old, and sorry, you guys. I know you hate to hear that, especially female student. But I know you guys are very young. But someday you will look like her because time eclipse deterioration is a natural process happening to everyone, and no one can escape this process. For cultural heritage conservation, using a not that correct analogy, we are trying to reverse the time process, reverse the time eclipse process, and try to bring the youth back to the face and make this old-looking lady to look new and pretty again. So in conservation of tangible cultural heritage, the conservation or restoration is somehow similar to plastic surgery to a certain extent. We are trying to revitalize the artifacts, just like we revitalize our face, right? And also we are trying to remove some trace of time on the face, trying to, for instance, to fill the crack or to repaint the pigments on a building, for instance. But here is a very critical question. If we use the analogy of plastic surgery for cultural heritage conservation, if in general we want to reverse the time process, try to remove some traces related to the time eclipse, trying to make the outlook of a cultural heritage more attractive, trying to revitalize a cultural heritage. Then in reality, in actual practice, we will have so many different options at the end. For instance, we will have, just like doing the plastic surgery, right? You can make your face looking like this. Also, you can have this version, right? I think like for this version, she just like make the eyes bigger and larger. I know different students might have like very diverse opinion. Which one is better or which one is more authentic, right? So when we apply this issue in the conservation of cultural heritage, we might have the same issue and problem. For instance, we have a very badly maintained building. We want to preserve that building. We know it is very important. And that building was built in, for instance, 1850. Some information was already disappeared. And the building was rebuilt so many times in its life. For instance, the building was rebuilt again in 1930s, for instance. And then we used and abandoned, and some people came in and make some changes, etc., and then have some new renovation, and then abandon again. When we try to revitalize that building, should we just reverse everything back to the beginning? And if so, what happened to all the stories happened right after the beginning of its construction? So I want to talk about this issue a bit later. In the conservation of painting, and I want to start with painting in the beginning because painting or statue will be a little bit easier for you to understand when we get to the issue of a house or a village. The situation will be more complicated. So here I want to quote a very famous discussion. Giovanni Sacrosaldo. He is a very famous conservator. He did a lot of very significant work, and also he developed a lot of theories associated with the conservation of painting. And during the 19th century, when conservators in museums, they try to do the conservation work for oil painting, they already realized here is the problem. The time reversing process actually is quite tricky. To which point we should stop in order to better present the original looking of the painting, but at the same time, we can keep and maintain the status of that oil painting. So in general, he developed some ideas, but before we develop this idea, he made a very critical part, which is the conservation and restoration cannot be just decided by our common sense. Definitely, you need to have some chemistry background. You need to understand art history, understand the stylistic development in different periods, and also you need to have a physical background to understand what kind of materials could be employed for conservation. And then I want to use this statue as an example. It is a very famous statue. It's Venus de Milo. Anyone knows this statue before? No. Okay, so why this statue is famous? Of course, the face is beautiful and the body is very beautiful. But what makes this statue famous actually is the lacking of the arms. And it creates a lot of places for imagination. So that's the reason why this statue is so popular and famous. And now, if we want to restore this statue, and the arms already broken, some genius conservator decided to develop a great project to do the conservation. But unfortunately, that conservator did not have any textual record to indicate how these two arms look like. So when he tried to do the conservation, he will have this option, and he can also have this option, and he can also have this option, like to put the two arms this way, and also to do it the other way. So when we try to think about, okay, when we are conserving a broken artifact or broken statue, and we are missing some information here, and that kind of information is missing it's lost forever. We cannot find that kind of information in any other places. And when we try to do the conservation, we will deal with a lot of hypothetical restoration. We have so many different options. And under this condition, we also don't have any other information to help us make the judgment, make the evaluation, saying which one is more authentic. So in this case, what we should do. So I want to also use one more example to highlight the difficulties in reality. It is, again, an oil painting, and it is, you have like 3 different versions. And by the way, this one dates back to the 13th century, about 800 years old. It is now the current status. We can try to do some analysis of the pigments and try to redraw the whole thing like that. Also, we can just skip the part that already missed, just leave it there, but to conserve the part here, which is here, that still preserved. So I want to ask you a question. I know that just a few students here. Which one looks better to you? Any suggestion? This is original. And the left and right are 2 hypothetical restoration. Which one looks better to you? If you have this painting, oil painting, and you are the owner, and you need to do the restoration, and you can only make one decision. And I will explain later, because once you make the decision, then you basically cannot reverse back. Which one you are going to do? Left or right? Left. This one? Oh, sorry, what is your name? Oh, why? Why can you say a little bit why you prefer the left version? Mm-hmm. And? More pretty looking? Oh, you have other question?
I would also choose the left one because it has the complete image of
Okay, the information is like looks more complete to you, right? And this one you are missing too much. So you think this version is better. Okay. But here is the information, or here is the very critical issue we need to think about. If we do the conservation and we store everything back to like this stage, which is pretty much like this, then we will have quite some challenges. The most critical one is how can we be certain that like this missing part were painted before. Yes, of course, we can do some testing. We can, for instance, we can scrape like some minerals and send the minerals for testing and make some projection, assuming like other parts use similar pigments, or we can just see the straight line here, and this part is missing. Then maybe like this part should just like connect together. Yes, we can do that, but according to the basic conservation principles, in general, it is better to be conservative, especially when we are dealing with issues or places where we need to have assumption. We need to assume how ancient painters work, or how people make things in a certain way. Once we need to get to this kind of gray area, the basic principle or the golden rule in conservation is it's better to just stop here. Yes, it may be like a little bit regrettable we have some missing pieces. But if we want to respect the historical value of the painting, if we want to be honest to other audience, telling them we actually don't have the information, right? The best way to do actually is just to leave the places that we don't have information blanket. Just leave it there and telling the audience, well, it is true, it is so regrettable that we cannot make it complete, make it reverse back to the original point, but here is the reality. We don't have some other information, and that's the reason why we still need to preserve this oil painting, because we already lost a lot of information. So that's the reason why I want to highlight in the beginning that cultural heritage conservation is quite different from a general understanding of plastic surgery, right? For the general public, when we talk about plastic surgery, we want to be perfect, right? We want to be like absolutely good looking, and whoever going to the hospital, right, to do the plastic surgery, he or she definitely wants to look perfect, right? They want to like look very good, look very young, right? And try to erase all the traces, all the time traces, right? But in conservation of cultural heritage, we have to preserve the cultural heritage, yes. We have to maintain like the structure, but at the same time, we also want to keep all the historical information as much as possible. Telling the audience what we know at this stage, and telling the conservators in the future that these places were missing places. We don't know the information. Maybe if you have better techniques, better technology, if you can let me know, or let the audience know the mineral of the pigments, or what kind of materials were used, or how the clothes were drawn, that would be great. You can go ahead to do the conservation. But if you are hesitated, if you don't have the information, it is better to just stop, to present to the audience what we know and what we don't know. So here is very important, okay? To be honest to the audience and to try to keep as much historical information as possible. Okay, so when we go back to this question, the best answer, if I ask you, okay, which one among these four hypothetical restoration will be the best? The perfect answer will be none of them. Because, as I mentioned, the Venus de Milo did not have any other textual records mentioning how the two arms look like. The information already lost. Even though like you might prefer one of these options among the four hypothetical restoration plans, none of them have the authentic information indicating the two arms should look like originally, right? These four options are just based on the projection, based on our imagination. And according to the principle I just mentioned before, for doing conservation, it is better to be more conservative. Wherever we have places, we need to use our imagination. We need to project. We need to assume something. Then it is better to just stop. To tell the audience, maybe it is the best scenario, and it is the reason why this statue looks so fantastic. Okay, so I want to keep moving to explain a key term that appears a lot of time in your reading material, not only for this week, but also for next week, which is called aesthetic value or authenticity. in the general understanding, when we talk about aesthetic value, we will think about, okay, we have to make things look good, look pretty, just like doing plastic surgery, right? We have to look good anyway. But in cultural heritage conservation, the term aesthetic value has some specific meaning. We should not only make things look good, we should not only reverse the time process, but also we need to preserve the historical changes, the historical process left on the surface. So, for instance, if we have like a broken pieces of house, yes, we need to put them back together. If we know like the painting is going to like falling apart, we have to try to maintain the structure, right, to prevent them falling apart eventually. But we are having other issues such as the gap here, the missing places, like here, like these spots. We lost the information forever, and we don't know how these spots, these places look like before. From the conservation perspective, we have to respect these kind of rules and try to record and try to maintain this kind of missing information during the conservation. So for aesthetic value, we are not just talking about beautifulness. We also need to think about the historical process, whether we also preserve the entire social life, different stages of life, or different types of historical information on the surface, so that we can add one more dimension for the audience, for them to understand and evaluate the value of the cultural heritage. Another value that I need to talk about is the so-called historical value. So historical value is somehow related to aesthetic value, but has more specific meaning. So historical value means we need to understand the general temporary background of the artifact or cultural heritage. For instance, when we talk about the oil painting, we need to think about, okay, what kind of mineral pigments were used at the time? What kind of general skills, painting skills, were used by painters at the time? Or what kind of like materials, what kind of cloth or canvas were used at the time? For conserving a building, we need to understand what is the general architectural style at the time, what kind of building materials were used at the time, how people planned, how people design their buildings at the time. So when we try to conserve a cultural heritage, not just a painting but also a building, we can have some guideline. We are not like putting things together just based on our imagination. We have to make sure our plans or the way that we do the conservation actually can match with the styles, the traditions, or the techniques that were used at the time, so that we can maintain the historical information could be maintained during the conservation project. Okay, so in general, I can combine like the two values in a more simple way. Restoration is trying to combine the two values together. We have to, of course, we have to make them look good. For this case, this is a vase during the Greek period, and originally this one is broken together. We have to put all the fragments, all the shreds back together. We have to put them back in a way that look like the original vessel, of course, but we are doing with like this kind of missing pieces, missing piece. We don't have any other information for that. So in that kind of scenario, it is better to just leave them there. Use other type or other appropriate materials to fill the blank, but indicate to the audience that this information, these pieces, were lost forever. We could not find that. It is the way that the vessel look like when we restore the pieces together. And we have to keep some other traces, like using mark, or for instance, when the vessel used so many times, we can see the traces or marks left on the surface. During the conservation, we also need to preserve these kind of elements to tell the audience how the vessel or how the artifact was used in historical time. So here is the very key principle, which is we have to put them back together. But as long as it is possible without producing an artistic or historical forgery and without erasing every trace of the passage of time left on the work of art. Try not to make forgery, try to keep all the traces on the surface. So here are the basic and key information for conservation. Okay, any questions? Okay, if not, I will move on. As I said, in some cases we have missing pieces, right? We have to somehow strengthen the structure or make things stable. We have to put some materials on cultural heritage. And in general, we have some small principles for these kind of materials used in cultural heritage conservation. First, they must be recognizable. And second, they have to primarily related to structural. And the third one is very critical, reversible. So I will explain what it is. So for instance, in that case, it has to be recognizable. You cannot use the color or materials that having similar color like this or this, so that the audience cannot differentiate which part was original and which part was new. So you have to use some material with quite different color to indicate which part is new, right? It is quite different from doing a plastic surgery. And second, it has to be related to structure. You have to make sure that the material was used in order to strengthen the structure, to keep things pieced together. But other than that, don't put any new materials on. And third, reversible. Reversible means if I realize that, for instance, this piece is wrong, the shape should not look like this, there were some mistakes happened during the conservation. Later on, conservator can take this part out and without making any damage to the artifact. It is called reversible. Reversible basically means you can take the material out, take it off the surface, but without doing any structural or permanent harm on the cultural heritage. So in general, we have three principles: recognizable, related to structure, and also reversible. So I also want to use this as an illustration. In terms of structure, which means this framework, right, to hold things together. But if we are just talking about a small holes on the surface, it is quite debatable whether we should just make them look original because it is not related to structure, right? And second, we have to make things reversible, or make things make things reversible. So I want to use probably this one like this as an illustration. Reversible, just like a piece of chocolate. When you frozen it, it will be solid, but when you melt it and you just get liquid. So things have to be removed in the future. And I want to use this example to illustrate why conservation often takes a long time. It is Da Vinci's The Last Supper. It's a very famous oil painting. And that is the original looking appearance 30 years ago. And it is after restoration. But the whole process took 20 years to finish. And just finish this part. the reason is that the conservation has to make sure first, like the materials filling like this gap, like this falling part, have to be original. They have to do a lot of testing and analysis to make sure the pigment, the materials of the pigment were very similar to the original types of pigments. And then they have to understand the techniques, the ways Da Vinci paint this oil painting, the Last Supper, and they also they have to make sure the new painting that was added to the surface can be removed in the future. So conservation often takes a long time, and we have to take the historical factor into consideration. Going back to the question I thought to you in the beginning, we have different types of restoration in most cases. We have different options, right? Just like doing the plastic surgery, we can make the eyes smaller and then we can make the eyes bigger, right? Yes, it's true. Authenticity is often a matter of degree. We often have different options, right? And people might have their subjective preferences to choose which way is better. But still, we need to follow certain principles. We need to keep the original historical traces. We need to tell the audience which part we actually don't know. And what is more critical, don't try to make any fake history or cultural heritage. So even though we have two different options, but if you want to do a plastic surgery to make this beautiful lady look like a ET like that, it is not appropriate. So that's the reason I want to wrap this part to talk about authenticity, basic principles, and trying to keep the historical process on the surface. Okay, to summarize what I just mentioned for the first part, what is restoration? So restoration must aim to re-establish the potential unity of the work of art as long as it is possible without producing an artistic or historic false or forgery and without erasing the passage of time. So it is the general basic principle for restoration. Okay, so and I can summarize the basic principles here. First, we have to keep minimal intervention as long as that new elements or new parts are not necessary. Try to prevent that. Try to not doing too much additional work to cultural heritage, which means we try to keep the original status. We have to make sure appropriate materials were used, and then the materials have to be reversible. Before all this work were done, we need to have a lot of documentation to understand how people make things before and all the information related to the current status, so that we can make sure the strategies or techniques that we use for the cultural heritage can match the original historical value. What is more critical is that we need to prevent fakeness added to cultural heritage. Try to be honest to the audience. Don't make too much artificial information on the cultural heritage. It is very important, and I'm going to illustrate why some examples are better than the other based on these principles. Okay, so I want to ask a quick question. Do you guys need some rest? And I know because it's Friday afternoon, everyone should be tired. Can I just go quickly to the end, finish up the cases so that you guys can go home earlier? Is it okay? Okay, great. So now I want to talk more specifically the conservation for larger scale cultural heritage. Before, in the last 30 minutes, I'm talking about oil painting, statue, things that are small, movable. But now I want to talk about big, larger scale. Building, site, and monument. So having the foundation, I think it should be not that difficult to understand how to preserve the authenticity or try to conserve different types of information on buildings and sites. Especially for monuments, buildings, or archaeological sites, when we try to do the conservation, of course, we need to understand the basic information of materials. We need to understand the workmanship, what kind of techniques, what kind of skills were used, the general social setting, the background, how people make things in the past. And then we need to understand design, how that group of workers decide the building or decide the architecture in a certain way. So when we do conservation or restoration for tangible cultural heritage like monument, we need to have all this information first before we start to make any changes. For intangible cultural heritage, it would be more complicated, and I think I will go into like more specific challenges later. But in general, keep in mind when we are talking about intangible cultural heritage conservation, we also need to think about first whether we understand the techniques, how people employ the techniques to make things, even in current state, to understand, for instance, the language. If the intangible cultural heritage is related to singing and performance, we need to have some background information about the language, and then we need to have some basic understanding about the tradition, how people practice the intangible cultural heritage in their traditions, in their society. And then we also need to understand the basic like feeling and spirit, how people feel, how people conceptualize the intangible cultural heritage. And I want to talk about this document. This is called Operational Guidelines. And this document is quite useful and official if you want to really talk about and understand conservation and how authenticity was defined. It is like one of the most important official documents you need to refer. But of course, when I say official, it also means it is quite dry and boring. So anyway, it is the original document for all these kind of requirement. And if you want to go further down to understand cultural heritage better, you need to go through the original documents. So in these documents, it also highlight an issue which we already touched upon before, but I'm going to explain that later. Outstanding universal value. So before in lecture 1 and lecture 2, I talk about the ambiguity of understanding universal value. But in the official document, this term has some specific criteria. And these criteria are related to authenticity and integrity. And this criteria, in general, includes 6 different parts. And from now on, I'm going to use an initial term OUV to represent the whole term outstanding universal value. By definition, outstanding universal value means cultural and or natural significance which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. This is from the original Heritage Conservation Guideline. And this OUV includes 6 specific dimensions or aspects. When we try to evaluate, or the UNESCO people trying to evaluate OUV, they will look at whether they are masterpieces, have some interchange value, whether it is a testimony. Testimony here is very important to a tradition, a type of building, architecture, ensemble, or a landscape which illustrates significant stages in human history. In human history, traditional land use and symbols of value. So some of you might wonder, okay, yes, these terms, these criteria look very big terms to me. I know, yes, they are talking about significance. When we are talking about the testimony of a civilization, of course it is important, right? But how we can understand the meaning and how we can practice the OUV in reality. So remember, the OUV, this concept is originated from a very important document, Venice Charter. I mentioned that before, but I'm going to go back to this here. In this chapter, it talks about how to define and how to make sure the aesthetic and historic value could be preserved. And when we try to evaluate authenticity, when we try to evaluate OUV, according to this document, it has to be based on the aspect or respect for original material and authentic documents. Yes, we must stop at the point where contradiction begins. But the basic and the most fundamental criteria is that we need to make sure the material and everything have to be original. Sorry, this is my cell phone. Yeah, the Siri. I don't know why, but anyway, it's not your business. Okay, so I want to highlight this. It's very critical because according to Venice Charter, according to the original concept, whether a site, whether a historical building has outstanding universal value has to be dependent on whether the material, whether the layout, or whether the outlook are original. It's very, basically, very Eurocentric. According to that kind of concept, there is only either true or false in the whole world. If it is not original, right, then it is fake. So, according to this concept, if we try to evaluate the OUV of a building or a temple, for instance, we have to look at the structure, we have to look at the materials, we have to look at the decorations, and we have to make sure whether they represent the original materials or original structure. Okay, some students may say, yeah, why not? It is good, right? Original is good. Like, when you are dating with a boyfriend or girlfriend, you want to have some basic understanding what is his original looking, right? So original is good, but what is the problem here? So I want to highlight an issue from an anthropological perspective, which is authentic and fakeless are not very easy to differentiate in reality. The boundaries often not that clear in our daily life. If you are really interested in this issue, I would recommend you to read this Material Culture and Authenticity. And also for anthropology students, if you really want to explore this issue, you are very welcome to read Gordon Matthews' book, his latest book about the African merchants in Guangzhou. Actually, they are dealing with the similar questions. When people trying to do trading, when people are trying to sell goods, the boundary between authentic and faked goods are not that clear in most cases. For instance, in Guangzhou, for instance, when you try to search New Balance or to the to the retailer stores, you will find some so-called copycats, but they are not fake at all. We can have like Liu Balun, we can have something called Liu Buran. Look similar to New Balance with the N or with the NB, right? They're basically a copycat of New Balance. But remember, when we are trying to say they are fake products, they're not that fake at all, right? Because they are just New Balance, they are not New Balance. They already indicate they are not New Balance, right? They are just imitating New Balance, but they are not New Balance at all. So if we have this pair of shoes, New Buran, right? You cannot complain that, okay, this is not an authentic pair of shoes. Well, the label already indicates it's not authentic, right? So for a lot of people, especially for merchants, and Gordon Matthews' case is very illustrating for this point. People can make authentic positions for themselves in and through fake objects. Even though these objects, we know, yes, from a legal perspective, they are fake objects. But when these objects were used, and especially when people of different rank in different geographical areas, they have different economic needs, when they trade these objects or when they use these objects, they will add some new meaning, right, to the objects. And they will have different understanding of the authentic and fakeness. So in anthropology, what we try to do is try to understand how people understand and define authenticity instead of trying to put our finger on this and this, saying that they are fake. So for cultural heritage conservation, we also need to do the same thing. And here is a very good example. In Japan, for a lot of famous temples, they have a practice, traditional practice. And this practice, the year might be different, but in general, it is called Shinkanen Dai, which means the entire building, especially those famous and traditional buildings. The whole buildings will be disassembled, will be taken apart. And workers, they will recollect new materials to rebuild the temple or the structure within certain period of time and using the original techniques and methods. And I'm going to show you this video and so that you can understand like what I'm talking about better. In the beginning, they also have this ritual, and most workers they will follow these rituals. They will have the like ceremony before they cutting the trees, and they select certain types of trees to cut.
1000年育ったのが500年しか持たなかったらそれは技術が悪いんですけどこれは心がけですけども
Because the buildings, like the big temples, we will build certain period of time. That's the reason techniques could be maintained and transmitted very well from one generation to the next generation.
森のエッセンスです。森って気持ちがいいってですね、普段許されないところで生きているという証拠ですね。
And of course, they will like plant the trees for the next generation to cut down in the future. They will not just like cutting down all the trees. They also have the plan to like replant the trees for the future. Okay, I'm going to stop here. So in Japan, it's a very typical case to argue against the type of authentic understanding I mentioned before in the Venice chapter, right? If we try to employ that kind of authentic understanding in this case, a lot of temples in Japan will be classified as fake objects or fake artifacts or fake architectures because the materials were new, right? All the temples were rebuilt every 20 years. How come you have 100 years old building? But that's quite like controversial, right? Because we know Japan has a very good tradition, like maintaining their buildings, right? Maintaining their traditions. So a lot of scholars realize that the idea about authenticity mentioned in Venice chapter has a lot of issues, especially the issue related to Eurocentric biases. And these kind of biases might not be applicable in East Asian context. Because when we look at East Asian cultural heritage particular, we will have, like we are always dealing with wood architecture. Oh, sorry, I don't know why, but that the series just suddenly pops up. Okay, when we look at East Asian cultural heritage, like buildings or temples, most of them are wooden architecture. They use wood as major materials. Unlike like Western context, they use stone as the major building materials for churches or big monuments, right? But once we have wood as major building materials, then they must be very fragile. And also, the techniques will be very, very varied in different places. And also, like wood building cannot be maintained for a long time. We have to accept the reality. For instance, fire, like this is the Sheungnan in Seoul happened in 2008. It is a very important heritage site in Seoul, but the whole gate were burned down by an accident. So if we really want to employ the document, the principle for conservation, we have to change the understanding for authenticity. And that's the reason we have another key document, Lara document on authenticity. So this document was compiled in 1994 and was written in Japan. You can understand the background, right? Because the Japanese scholars, they were quite irritated by the typical Eurocentric definition of authenticity. And when they realized the authenticity definition cannot be really applicable in Japanese context, they are trying to talk and discuss with scholars in Europe and trying to talk to them how to have a better definition of authenticity. And that's the result after negotiation and discussion. So according to Lara document, a lot of scholars realize a very important thing. Authenticity cannot be solely judged on the originality of materials. Also, we need to understand the information. And also, we need to respect the practices for building houses, for building architectures, will be very different from culture to culture. And therefore, it's impossible to have a fixed criteria to judge the authenticity of cultural heritage. In the operational guideline, we have 6 different criteria, right? Fixed criteria to look at different aspects. But according to Lara document, scholars try to start to realize that this kind of fixed criteria are only relative, and we cannot apply all these fixed criteria in different cultural contexts. Instead, we really need to understand the techniques in different places and understand how people make things according to their tradition. So as long as the building or architecture were built based on the nature of the cultural heritage, based on the original context, based on their original skills, and especially based on their original practices. Just like the case in Japan. Yes, they rebuild big temples every 20 years, but we can see the video, right? The workers treat the rebuilding very seriously. They have the ceremony before the rebuilding. They even select certain types of tree, certain types of wood for rebuilding. They're not doing a sloppy job. They have very strict requirement for rebuilding. And they have very long list of tradition to follow. As long as we can be sure that the rebuilding process follow all these traditions, the local workers, the local people, they have very informative list showing how to do things in a certain way, and the practice and traditions and techniques are more or less similar to the original skills or original versions, then we have to respect the value, the historical value of this building. And also we need to recognize the authenticity of cultural heritage in that kind of cases. So that's the reason we have a more updated version of authenticity in the ICOMOS document in 2002. So authenticity in 2002 was defined as original condition of a site and its subsequent changes through historical time. So here is quite critical because according to the original document, even though the people in ICOMOS, they recognize, yes, we need to respect the aesthetic value, we need to respect the historical value. But when we look at the document, they didn't really respect the historical value, right? Because they only emphasize on the original material, original type. And here in 2002, the new definition tried to include not only the original state of an historical site, but also its subsequent changes into the basic definition. So for instance, the gate itself, this is the reconstruction after the fire incident. But during the reconstruction, the materials were original. The skills and methods were basically original. The South Korean government do a good job to reconstruct the gate because they emphasize on the cultural heritage very much. So in that kind of scenario, even though the gate or the gate is not original anymore, but based on the information and skills, we should not downgrade its authentic value, right? So authenticity for cultural heritage, according to this latest document, a definition, has to include later historical changes and other subsequent changes. And this is very important, and I will use an example to illustrate. Okay, so, but again, according to the 2002 document, we should limit reconstruction, especially reconstruction based on our imagination. I know it is tough, especially for archaeological site park. In a lot of cases, what we find is just a pit, the foundation, and it is very hard to show to the audience how a house 5,000 years ago looked like. Somehow we need to have some reconstruction. But in general, we have to limit and prevent imagined reconstruction and try to respect the fact that some information we don't have. And there are lots of information that we cannot really reconstruct during the study. Okay, I want to use one example first, again from South Korea for illustration before I wrap up this lecture. And this example is related to a temple. And in the east southern part of South Korea, here, called Gongju, very close to Busan here. Busan is here. I just give you some background about South Korea. It is Seoul, and probably one of the most famous tourist place in South Korea. And Busan is beautiful, but not that famous. And the temple is here. I'm going to talk about is here. And Busan is very beautiful and it has these small houses building along the foothill of mountain. These kind of houses appear in a lot of Korean TV soap opera. So and a lot of my students go to Busan to just see these buildings. And the building, the temple I'm going to talk about is this one. In Korean, it's called Bukusa. And for students who cannot read Chinese, It is the name of the temple. It is Buddha, is like the country or state, and it is temple. So basically, it's a Buddhist temple, and the entire temple, the original one, was built during the Tang Dynasty, about 1,000, maybe 400 years ago. But the whole thing basically gone. And like this version, this building, the original version was reconstructed during the 17th century. And like all these decoration and components preserved in this current status was basically preserved during the 1969 and 1970s. The South Korean government, they keep all these records. This site was very famous and very significant because it was given the title for World Cultural Heritage very early in 1995. It's also a very famous spot. So when you go to the temple, go to the site, it is not that big, but once you go there, and you can feel the sense of comfortable and quiet because first the site is not very crowded, and when you walk around the temple, basically you don't see a lot of new added element in different places. And one thing I want to highlight is this colorful decoration on the buildings, right, on the door, on the beams. They are original mineral pigments. During the conservation, the Cultural Heritage Department, the Cultural Heritage Department did not use modern industrial pigments. Instead, they just used the original mineral pigments to maintain like the green and the blue and the red colors. They try to use the original materials to paint the architectures to make them look like original. And second, I want to highlight is the intervention. So it is like the general outlook in the yard of the building. In most cases, you don't find any additional intervention like banner, like new added elements. So during the conservation, you can tell the Cultural Heritage Department in South Korea, they try to basically just preserve what they already found at the site during the 1960s and 1970s. And I try to keep any other additional buildings and elements away in order to give the audience or the tourists the authentic view how the temple looked like before, and try not to add too much imagined information in the yard. So that's the reason in the major courtyard here, you basically just see the pagoda and the small pagoda and some like flower decoration. That's it. There are not so many like new added irrelevant decorations in the temple. And also for the Buddhist figures or statues, they are also color painted, and the pigments were again original, or the original types of mineral pigments. And in the temple, you will see like this kind of lamps. I think this practice is originally from Japan, but I cannot figure it out like which places start first. Like the only added element or the elements that we can add to the temple is like these lamps, and in South Korea and Japan too, you can pay a little bit and buy a piece of card, and you can write your best wishes and just hang it underneath the lamp. Maybe it is a general practice, and but a lot of people like this, and I find a lot of very funny best wishes here written underneath the lamps. So another case I want to talk about is Nanhua Si, Nanhua in Guangdong as an illustration. So don't get me wrong, I'm not going to point my finger to this temple, and I know some students are Buddhists, and I don't want to be offensive, but I just want to highlight the differences between these two cases. And you have to recognize that there are completely different historical and political background in these two places. But I just want to illustrate the differences in terms of the cultural heritage conservation. So why I choose Nanka-Si? For one thing, Nanka-Si is very close to Hong Kong. The place is in Shaoguan, Xiuguan. So if you want to visit the site, you can take the high-speed train from Shenzhen to there. It will take only 1.5 hour, very fast. And this temple is one of the earliest temple in the entire Guangdong. The original foundation or the original temple was built during the Tang Dynasty, around 1,400 years ago, very, very early. But unfortunately, that original temple gone or maybe destroyed so many times. So this complex or this version was built around 1910 and 1930s, which is quite late reconstruction. And why the temple is so significant and so important. Remember, Nanka-Si, some of students might not be familiar with that, but a lot of people in Guangzhou, they are very keen on this temple and drive from Guangzhou to Shaoguan to visit the temple because in this temple, you can see 3 Buddhist mummies. I know the term mummy is not a good term, but it is the easiest way to say what it is. It is not a statue. It is a mummy. Inside this is a human body, a human skeleton. But these 3 bodies, or the owners of these 3 mummies, are very high, well-known and respected monks. One of them can date all the way back to the Middle Tang Dynasty. Around 1,000 years, at least 1,000 years ago. And when they died, for some reasons, their body became mummy. And the other believers or other Buddhists, they just wrapped the body with cloth, and somehow the body became mummy. So Nanka-Si is famous for the 3 Buddhist mummy. And this temple was rebuilt. The whole thing was rebuilt in the around 1910 and 1930s. And you can even see one of the image showing the rebuilding process. And so Nanka-Si was new, and according to historical document, we can even tell the entire Nanka-Si. This is the modern Nanka-Si that we can visit. We can see actually was moved originally from this side toward east, and we will have the historical document. And this is the document. This is the photo taken in 1930, showing the gate, the entrance, how the entrance looked like in 1930s. So the whole thing was rebuilt in 1930s. And because of a lot of reconstruction, it is not surprising to see first, we can have houses or architecture dating to different periods. But in Nanka-Si, because all the focus are on the 3 Buddhist mummies, for these small scale houses or buildings, not that relevant to the Buddhist mummy. No one really care about that. So you can see very badly maintained houses everywhere inside Nanka-Si. As long as the houses are not the main temple or not the temple related to the Buddhist mummy, no one really care about that. And you also have the tablets dating to the different periods. This one is from the Northern Song Dynasty, at least again 1,000 years ago. But during the reconstruction process, the original tablet probably was broken, and in the historical period, this one was embedded within the wall of a late house. So when you visit the temple, you will feel a little bit confusing because you often find imitation of newly added elements everywhere. For instance, it is one of the mirrors that you can see in the yard. So it is basically late imitation of the Dunhuang mirrors, the original murals that was painted before the Tang Dynasty So probably they don't know how to paint the mural, so they just imitate some Tang Dynasty murals and just like make it filled. And also we have like this kind of new added places for burning scents in very traditional Chinese way, just like Huang Da Xian, Wang Dai Xin, right? You have the scents burning practices. So they have like a lot of places for people to burn the scents. In Nanhua Si, one thing you can tell immediately is that the whole building or the whole temple was basically brand new. For instance, like this is the major temple or the major building, and like the painting was new, the wall was newly painted, everyone was brand new. Because for believers or for common people, if they have a very like old-looking temple, it might be a shame for that. They want to have they want to show they are very dedicated to their belief, and they want to have very good-looking Buddhist temple. So when you look at the temple, you find like newly painted temples or walls or beams everywhere. I guess they are following the Korean or Japanese way, having the lamps in different colors. But it's not for holding the wish card. They are just lamps hanging out here for a known purpose. So for Nanhua Si, you can find a lot of historical documents, and it would be fun if you compare the original version and to the latest version. They're the same building, but in different time. This one was taken in 1930s, and this one is new. And you can see like some major changes already made, like this part and like this part. They completely changed the wall here. This part is a little bit dark. Probably you can see them better in the PowerPoint. And there's like Da Hong Bao Dian, Da Hong Bao Dian here, and in this latest version, it's basically they're gone. There is a more dramatic difference between the original Nanhua Temple and this new Nanhua Temple. The same pagoda, these two are the same, and the angle is more or less like similar, but this photo was taken in 1918, and this temple, this building, was originally for the 3 Buddhist mummies. You can tell because they are big, and the 3 Buddhist mummies are very significant for the believers. So they need to have a very large temple for the mummies. But unfortunately, the building's gone, and now we have the brand new temple for the 3 Buddhist mummies. So if you want to visit Nanhua Si, and if you want to see the 3 Buddhist mummies, you will see this temple is called Zhou Ding Zhu Dian, which means the major temple for the ancestors. And again, this temple, this ancestral temple is brand new, and not only the painting, but also the window and the wall. So basically everything is brand new. So what I want to illustrate here through these 2 cases is some reflection. So don't take me wrong, I'm not pointing my finger saying that Nanhua Si is a bad illustration, because from an anthropological perspective, it is not legitimate to judge the practice there. Instead, probably we should try to understand why and how the temple was preserved in a certain way. There should be some reasons behind people doing the conservation. And for anthropologists, what we need to do is try to understand how and why. And remember, you cannot step into the same river twice. So theoretically, we have to respect the history, and it is impossible and probably not necessary to rebuild the original Nanhua Temple, even though we have some historical document. But I don't think it is necessary to rebuild the whole and original Nanhua Temple. So don't take me wrong here. But I want to compare the Nankwa Temple and another temple in South Korea. It is trying to give you a sense. For conservation, we can have different practices or different options. And these differences might give you different understanding about the history and the significance of these temples. For the case in South Korea, yes, it is probably one of the best examples that we can find for conserving Buddhist temple. The buildings, of course, has a long history, and the local government, the South Korean government, did a good job trying to maintain the paintings, the layout, and other types of the structures, try to limit the intervention, etc., to give the audience a sense how the buildings originally look like, and trying to keep other historical information. So we can actually learn a lot when we visit the site. But for the Nankwa Si Temple, the Nankwa Temple example, what we learned actually is quite limited, to be honest, especially from a cultural heritage perspective. And it is quite regrettable that the original architectural styles were not that well represented, and there are too many added elements in the yard and on the temple. And to be honest, there are a lot of photos and information there. So for doing a cultural heritage conservation project in cases like Nankwa Si, yes, we have to respect the Buddhist monks and respect their traditions, but somehow we might need to think about whether this historical information should be represented on these buildings, especially when the Chinese government or the Guangdong government contributing some money to do the conservation. Probably they need to think about for the general public, for people who are interested in the temples in Guangdong, whether they are legitimate to think about or to know more about the architectural styles, the paintings, or other histories about this interesting and important temple, rather than, okay, a very typical tourist spot. People went there, go straight to the Buddhist mummy temple, take a look or take a photo, if you don't mind, to take the photos of the 3 Buddhist mummies, and that's it. So when we understand and try to visit cultural heritage sites, maybe we can have more meaningful conversation to the public or to other people in order to understand maybe the story could be told in a different way, so that other people can enjoy the story better through the new understanding. Okay, so I want to wrap up here because I almost ran out of time. Finally, I want to talk about integrity. So integrity basically means whether the area preserved is representative enough to showcase the history and other changes and other major characteristics related to the cultural heritage site. So for instance, the Bukasa in South Korea, when we visit the site, we feel very comfortable because not only the major temples were maintained very well, the entire layout and the yard and the garden scenes